In just a couple of weeks, you might not care about this, but it's important to my husband and I have the blessing and the privilege of marrying our niece and her fiance. And so I've been doing a little bit of work on that this week, and as I've been thinking about that, they're going to be looking in one another's eyes, hanging on to each other's hands, and making some incredible promises to each other. They're going to promise to bind themselves to each other in sickness and in health, in wealth and in poor, whether things are going well or whether things are not going well. And there's going to be this community of people, family and friends, gathered as they make these promises to each other. And this community is meant to be there to support one another. And as I think about that, when we bind ourselves and we make promises like that, that's a pretty extravagant kind of love, to say, I'm going to commit myself to you regardless of the situation and the circumstances. And it also requires a renewable resource. We live in a day and age where renewable resources are very important, and there's one renewable resource that I think is the most important of all, and that's love. And we're going to learn about love as a renewable resource in our passage this morning. You're going to hear the way this passage begins. It's happening immediately after another event. And what's happened is Jesus has just learned his really good friend, it's actually his cousin, John the Baptist, has been killed. And so Jesus heads off to a deserted place to spend time alone, no doubt to grieve and perhaps to pray, but just, I think, to get away for a little bit and experience some solitude. And you're going to find out that it doesn't remain a deserted place for very long because people find him. Let's read together and find out what happens with this extravagant renewable resource called love. Now when Jesus heard this is about his cousin John the Baptist, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, and he blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Have you ever planned and prepared a meal for a really large group of people and wondered, did I make enough? Is there enough food here for everyone to eat? My husband and I, on a couple of different occasions, have actually invited fairly large groups of people and have fed more than 50 people in one sitting. And to us, we think, okay, that's pretty big. And as we're making this spread, we wonder, and we know they're coming. They've replied. They've said, yes, we're going to be there. We've sent in our RSVP. But still with doing that, we've wondered, did we make enough food, even though we had time to plan and prepare? And here we've got the disciples here in a deserted place with Jesus, 5,000 men plus women and children. The disciples, we've got to give them some credit, I think, and cut them some slack, because they're concerned. I think they are concerned for the people, but they haven't had any time to plan and prepare to feed them. And in this deserted place, their solution is, let's send them back to the towns, let them get something to eat. They could always probably catch up later and hear what Jesus has to say later. And when they mention this to Jesus' response, it might sound a bit odd, but he says, there's no need to send them away. You feed them. And their response is, but we have nothing here. We have nothing but 5 loaves and 2 fish. We have nothing here. Nothing here but. Nothing but. I wonder how much we at times feel like the disciples, that we have nothing here but, or nothing but. And we wonder, is it going to be enough? I know I've thought that on occasion. But Lord, you don't understand. Do you see all these people? I'm only one person. I have nothing but ... We could probably all fill in the nothing but. And as I thought about this and the way Jesus took what they had and multiplied it, there is a modern day example that I think is perfect to consider. And it has to do with the relationship I mentioned at the very beginning of the service, the one that we're trying to deepen with Kids Food Basket. If you weren't here and you didn't hear the statistics, they pack more than 6,000 sack suppers every single day. Now I want you to imagine with me. Amy, if you don't mind, I'm going to use you as an example. For those of you who don't know Amy Koiker, Amy works in the food service department at Calvin College, just 2 miles down the road here. I don't know how many students, I know it's several thousand students you feed every single day. But I know that if I went to Amy, and she'd be willing, I'm sure she'd give it all her best and she would try, but if I went to her and I said, Amy, I have more than 6,000 kids that I need you to feed every single day this week. I want you to do this by yourself, maybe a couple friends, using just the food you've got in your home, and I want you to pack all these lunches, and oh, by the way, pack them up in your car and get them there, and you get to do this every day. She'd probably look at me like I'm nuts. She might look at me that way anyway, but if I asked any one of you here to try accomplishing that task on your own, you'd go, what? But I have nothing but this box of fruit snacks. I have nothing here in my cupboard but this jar of peanut butter. Or I have nothing here but this box of granola bars. Or I have nothing but this pack of packaged fruit. Or I have nothing but this jar of mayonnaise or this pack of tuna fish. Or you might reach in your pocket and say, well, gee, I have nothing here but $3. Or I have nothing here but 9 pennies. What is God going to do with that? What will God do with it? And you know what? We see in our passage this morning the way God took those 5 loaves and those 2 fish and multiplied it, and it became enough to feed, not only feed, but they were completely satisfied. Plus there was 12 baskets left over. And this isn't the first time something like this happens in Scripture. There's a story actually in the Old Testament. I don't know if you're familiar with it. There's this man, and this is in 2 Kings 4 if you want to go back and read it later, 2 Kings 4, 42 through 44. There's this man who comes from Baal Shalishah, and he comes to go see the prophet Elijah. And when he comes to him, he comes with 20 loaves of barley and some fresh barley, and Elijah tells him, okay, I want you to take that now and you feed these 100 people that are gathered here. And the man knows, logically, thinking humanly, that's not enough to feed 100 people. That's not enough to feed who's here. And Elijah tells him, don't worry, it's okay. Feed it to him anyway. There's going to be leftovers. And what I find interesting in these stories, in both of them, is the way that God takes it and does something miraculous with it. And God can do the same with our nothing buts. But it requires one thing, couple things actually. In here we saw, in both of these stories, that the people were willing to give it to somebody else. This requires trust. Trust. The disciples say, we have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. Jesus' response? Give it to me anyway. Bring it here. Bring it here. This means we can't hang on to things with clenched fists. Whether it's the $3 I've got in my pocket, and guess what? This is 3 suppers. Or the 9 pennies in my pocket, we might be thinking, what on earth is God going to do with $3 or 9 pennies? But you know what? That $3 could be combined with somebody else's $3. Those 9 pennies combined with somebody else's pennies, nickels, dimes, and quarters, and can become something more. And the same thing, well, all I've got is this tuna fish. Well, Amy might have the jar of mayonnaise, and together we can make, with the tuna fish and mayonnaise, we can make maybe 10 sandwiches. The same thing with the peanut butter. And the fruit can go in there and be something healthy. And there's something interesting when God takes it and multiplies it and helps it become more. It becomes more. And what I find interesting, and this is we'll touch on this actually in the discussion more at the end. The loaves and the fish, whose were they? Did you hear that? Well, that wasn't actually in this passage we read this morning. That's actually in the Gospel of John. And that's the only gospel that mentions that the fish and the loaves come from a boy. But regardless, you're right, Linda. They weren't theirs. They weren't the disciples. They belonged to somebody else. So all of our nothing buts, who do they belong to? To God. They don't belong to us anyway. They've been entrusted to us to care for. And when I stopped and I was thinking about that more deeply this week, I thought of all the times I say, but God, but, and I want to hold on to them and not give them. I started to have to ask myself, who do I trust more with the things that have been entrusted to me? Do I trust God more, or do I trust myself more? What a challenge. And I thought, how many times a week do I trust in myself more than I trust God? And God's the one who gave me all of it anyway. And not gave, it belongs to Him. I'm simply a caretaker of it. And hands down, God's going to do more with it on every single occasion than I ever can anyway. First thing, trust God. The second thing I really noticed in this passage that I think is applicable and helpful for us today, and it has to do with compassion and generosity. The disciples, and I don't think they were being mean. This is where I said I think we have to cut them some slack. They wanted to send everybody home, and I think they were genuinely concerned for their physical well-being. But is that our response when somebody comes to us with a need? I have nothing but. You're going to have to go. Or will we, like Jesus, have compassion? Will we, like Jesus, have compassion and say, come, here's what I have. I can share it with you, and I trust in God that God's going to take this and that it will be enough. Do we have compassion and mercy and generosity? I told you at the very beginning of the service that this passage was kind of interesting because there's a way in which it's a succession of what happens right before here, and that these stories are linked. And the first story before here has to do with the beheading of John the Baptist. But there's some other unique things going on there because this is happening as a part of Herod's kingdom. And Herod's kingdom and God's kingdom, the kingdom of heaven, are completely different. They're so opposite, so different. And the king that we claim to follow is a king who's generous and a king who is compassionate. And yet if we turn back just 3 short chapters, I'm blown away, but do you know what Jesus is called? A glutton. He's called a glutton and a drunkard. Does the person here in this story who first of all had compassion on people and cured their sick, and then who took 5 loaves and 2 fish and made that become enough and shared that, does this sound like somebody who's a glutton? Somebody who puts on a spread that's enough to feed 5,000 men, children, women, and there's still 12 baskets left over. That doesn't sound anywhere close to the description of a glutton to me. So we see this picture of this comparison of the kingdom of heaven to the comparison of the kingdom of Herod, who was gluttonous and throws this wild party for his desires, on one hand, and on the other hand, we see this beautiful image of something else happening. Try to imagine this with me now, okay? Jesus took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and in his hands, he has them. He looks up to heaven, blesses them, or gives thanks for the loaves. He breaks them, and he gives them to the people to eat. What does this sound like to you? The Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper. That's a table of plenty where all are invited, none are refused or turned away, and there's leftovers. And the beauty in this passage as well, when we see this imagery to the Lord's Supper and what can happen there, is that Christ comes to us in a unique way and something miraculous happens, where we experience community on a new level, community with Jesus Christ, community with one another. And there's something phenomenal that happens in community when Christ is at the center of that community. Something phenomenal. And as I kept thinking about this imagery with the Lord's Supper there as well, it made me wonder, what if Jesus had said, "Father, you want me to do what? I have nothing here but. I have nothing but. I have nothing but my life. And I'm willing to give it anyway. I'm willing to give it." And now you talk about the amount of people that are fed. And plus, another beautiful thing when you're thinking about those 12 baskets, because many believe that's a symbolic representation of the 12 tribes of Israel, and how we see now in the New Testament, we've got 12, right? 12 disciples. So it's carrying on into the New Testament as a continuation of what's meant to continue and not end. And I wonder here how many of us are waiting, holding on to our nothing buts, whatever they are, thinking, but as soon as I have more, or as soon as it looks a little better, or it's perfect. If we're waiting for that perfect offering or for that time when it's more, what if more never comes? And it's never going to be perfect until Christ returns. And I ran across an interesting quote this week. John, being from Canada, you're going to appreciate this. It's actually from Leonard Cohen, this artist. I like his music. And he had this album that he produced in the early 90s called Anthem. And in there, he's got these 4 lines that I think are so applicable to what we're talking about this morning. Here's what the lyrics are. "Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. That's how the light gets in, no matter how imperfect or the little bit we might think or the little bit we just might be saying ourselves, it's not going to make a difference. It's not going to make, what sort of difference is this ever going to make? I wonder with Kids Food Basket I think it was a principal who started it, if she would have said to the student she saw going hungry and picking through the trash before she started Kids Food Basket, if she would have had those same thoughts, but I have nothing but. And now here that organization has grown to the point where they're feeding more than 6,000 children every day. Look what God can do. God will take our imperfect offerings and combine them, but are we courageous enough to be willing to give them and allow God to use them and combine them with somebody else? And that's the power and the beauty of community. So you can call it whatever you want. You can call it the best looking potluck supper you ever saw, the best looking sack supper combination you ever saw. But to me, I see that, and I see the power of community with Jesus Christ at the center of the community, who can make all things new and has the power and the ability to make it perfect, where there will still be leftovers. Would you pray with me, please?